market shares, market positions are redistributed during crisis, not during good times.
Right.
And innovations, new ideas, creativity develop in crisis.
What most companies misunderstand when it comes to pricing is the direct correlation to value, or more importantly, perceived value within the marketplace, says today's Ask an Expert. Hi, I'm Joshua Carlson, co-founder of Propelo Media. Today I sit down with Hermann Simon. He is the former CEO and chairperson of Simon and Kucher and Associates. It's the largest and most reputable pricing consultancy in the world. Today we're going to talk about the importance of pricing strategy before you even begin developing your product. We're also going to talk about how a 1% change in pricing can actually give you a 10% lift in profitability. And finally, we're going to talk about pricing strategies for today's tumultuous environment. Now let's hear what Hermann has to say. Hermann, thank you so much for coming on our Ask an Expert.
Joshua, good morning in Portland.
And
It's
good
afternoon
afternoon
in
in
Germany.
Germany.
Yeah,
Yeah,
thank
right,
you.
right. Okay, so you are well regarded as a renowned pricing expert, but I'd like to go back to the beginning where this all started for you.
As so often in life, it started with chance. I selected pricing strategies for new products as my doctoral dissertation topic, and from there, I never got rid of this topic. It pursued me for the rest of my life.
What was it though that got you into that pricing situation in the first place? I mean, there's so much you can choose from, so why
Yeah,
pricing?
I got a very theoretical and quantitative education in economics at the University of Bonn. And I liked the professor who taught this field, price theory. It was purely theoretical, mathematical, no practical relevance. But later on, I had the ambition to use these models, equations, econometric assessments to improve pricing practice. And that took a couple of years, this transition from theory to practice,
Yep.
but eventually it worked. And today we are the leading price consultant in the world, Simon, Kucher Partners, with 1,500 people.
Well, yeah, it's clearly worked very well. So I want to talk about the theory transitioning to practice. What is it that most companies misunderstand about pricing?
The most important aspect of pricing is actually not price as such, but its value,
Okay.
or more precisely, perceived value by the customer.
Okay.
Because the willingness to pay a certain price is always the reflection of the perceived value. If this perceived value is higher, people are willing to pay more. If it's lower, they are not willing to pay more. So understanding and quantifying the value is a big challenge for companies, and many of them are not really capturing the value in a precise and reliable way.
So that's a good point. What are the ways that an organization can, I guess, assess the value in the marketplace with the customers?
I think you should distinguish between consumer products and industrial products. For industrial products, say for a truck, you can often do an economic calculation. You have costs, you have revenue coming from the product, you have maintenance, etc. So there, the value can be calculated and expressed in economic terms, in quantitative terms.
Okay.
For consumer goods, that's typically more difficult. What is the value of a smartphone, of an iPhone, compared to a phone from Samsung? That's not immediately visible, understandable, or quantifiable. But ultimately, since the price is always a number, the value must also be expressed in numbers. And one of the most difficult aspects there is the brand. What is the value of a brand?
Right. And so so it sounds like what you're saying is when it comes to consumer side of things, you're kind of hedging on what the price is. And is it a matter of just assessing when you've established a price point to see how the sales are reacting to that price point, and then you make adjustments from there?
That's a very risky way to do it, because if you make a mistake when you introduce a new product, for instance, you introduce it at a too low price, it sells a lot, then it could become very difficult to raise the price, and it could also become impossible to re-establish, to reposition the image. Because if the product has been perceived as cheaply as being low positioned in the beginning, you can hardly correct that. In the same way, some products may have failed because they were introduced at a too high price. They were not accepted in the market, and then they failed and became flops. So getting it right from the very beginning is very, very important.
So if we're introducing a new product or a new service, do we rely on competitors in the marketplace to kind of find where we think our price based upon how we think our value is different?
I would first say that starting very early with these considerations is critical. Before you develop the product, you must know the target position of the product in order to get the costs right. And of course, you also compare the product and the price, the quality to competitive products and prices. But the most important aspect is always the value to consumer. So do not follow competitors naively. Do not do cost plus pricing, but put the value of the customer in the first place and try to derive your price from there. From the very beginning, from the research and development stage until the actual market launch.
So I like that. That's a very interesting consideration that we should be thinking pricing way in advance. And it also sounds like it's going to shape what the final product is, because you're actually taking into consideration what the marketplace is presently doing, and then you're applying that to what kind of innovation or adaptation you want to introduce with your product.
Yeah, a very important method is what we call target pricing, and derived from that target costing. Let's assume you want to introduce a smartphone for poor African countries.
Sure.
So you may set a target price below $100, because only at this price level, most people there will be able to afford such a smartphone.
Okay.
So you would start with the demand on your R&D engineers to develop a product which we can manufacture for less than $100. Whether that's possible is an open question, which has to be addressed and answered in the course of the development. But you should have this clear notion where you want to position your product when it's introduced in the market. And this is, of course, this target position has to be derived from the market. In a rich country, you can afford to introduce a smartphone at $1,000 or more.
Right.
But in a poor country, that's impossible. It would only get a very, very small market share.
Okay. So what are you seeing as it pertains to pricing today in our current economic kind of environment?
Of course, under the current conditions of Corona, etc., there is an extreme uncertainty. And you have to distinguish between industries. If you are in tourism or even in airlines, price and pricing, even aggressive prices, are not going to solve your problems.
Right.
Because people don't go on a cruise ship even if you offer it for nothing.
Right.
People avoid to fly even if you offer very, very attractive prices. On the other hand, if you are introducing a new electric car, which say is superior to Tesla, you can afford to charge a high price.
Sure.
There are fewer cars bought right now, but with the perspective of recovery, etc., there the price would not prevent customers from buying the car if the mileage, the reach, the quality, the design are attractive and create high perceived value.
So for those industries such as the cruise ships or the airlines where they are obviously struggling from situations that are out of their control, what is the recommendation from a pricing strategy? I mean, to your point, even if a cruise ship called me today and said, "Hey, we'd welcome you for free," I wouldn't go to it right now. So what is the pricing recommendation for businesses like that?
Let me take the airline case.
Okay.
I went 2 weeks ago from Cologne to Berlin, and I was astonished how low the price for the flight was.
Okay.
I would rather recommend that they have a high price right now because the capacity utilization will anyway be low,
Yep.
and only people go who have to go. So that's a distance from Cologne to Berlin of about 600 kilometers, where the train takes 4 hours or so. That's too long for me. I also don't want to know to use a train. It's too long for me to use the car. So
Right.
the only alternative is the plane.
Sure.
And I would have been willing to pay twice or 3 times the price they were asking for.
Okay.
And since the price elasticity is low, so it means that you do not attract more passengers by having a lower price, by cutting the price. I would, in this situation, especially on business relations, keep the price rather high.
Okay. And
Even increase it compared to the price we had last year under normal conditions.
okay. Well, and that's why I asked. I'm
Let
curious
me
what
give
it's.
you another example, which is quite
Sure.
interesting. We have in my city here, Bonn, Germany, the former capital of Germany, we have a parking garage in the marketplace, in the very center. And they cut the price half on Sundays. But on Sundays, hardly anybody goes into the city. So it does not create additional demand. They could actually
Double it.
double the price
Right.
and still have low capacity utilization, but a much better profitability. That is an important distinction. Is demand low or high?
Mm-hmm.
That has nothing to do with the optimal price. The optimal price depends on when the so-called price elasticity is high, whether you move volume with the price by cutting price, or whether volume does not decrease if you have a higher price. That is the determinant of the optimal price, not the demand level as such.
Okay. Well, so you talked about profitability. So I do want to talk about the differences between pricing and profitability and the strategies that businesses should be looking at.
I mean, the most important objective of a company is to make profit. There can be no discussion about that. And price is one of these 3 profit drivers. We have only 3:
Okay.
price, sales volume, and cost. And a very interesting question is, which of these 3 profit drivers is the most effective to increase profit? And we can clearly say that's the price. On average, if you can increase the price by 1% without losing volume, that's possible because that's only a small price
Sure.
adjustment, your profit will usually increase by 10%.
Right.
So the multiple price profit is 10. For costs, the typical multiple is 6. So a cost improvement, that's a decrease of 1%, typically leads to a 6% profit improvement. And for sales volume, it's only 4. Why? Because if sales volume go up,
Right.
marginal costs go up.
Right.
So the cost increases eat up a large part of the revenue increase, which comes from the volume growth. So we can say roughly 10 is the multiple for price, 6 for cost, 4 for sales volume.
So it'd actually be smarter to raise pricing a little bit. You might lose a little bit of market share, but profitability is still going to go up.
The price is the most effective profit driver. And one problem with managers is they are quite afraid to touch the price.
Right.
Why?
Because we're
Because
scared.
they're scared. you have no control how consumers react. You are never really certain. If you give a discount of 20%, do you really gain the volume you need? If you increase the price, are you going to lose customers and market share? They think they have more power over cost. So they like rather to touch costs because it's wages, it's vendor prices, etc. And this fear is a big mistake because it means that companies often sacrifice profits because they don't have the courage to increase the price or to charge a high price from the very beginning.
Right. Okay, so let's talk about pricing as it pertains to singular pricing versus tiered pricing models. What's your take on that?
The whole area of, say, from one dimension to multidimensional pricing, or you could say complex pricing systems, is extremely rich. And it has become even much more powerful through the internet. Okay. If we look at pricing innovations over the last 200 years, 80 to 90% of the innovations have come in the last 20 years. Things like freemium, variance, flat rate, pay as you go, etc. And the real potential of pricing lies in these complex structures, not just in the one-dimensional move up or down on the price scale. Okay. And the reason is very, very simple. Actually, if you think of a diagram where you have the price and the volume, and then you have the demand curve, or we call it sometimes price response curve. The surface under this demand curve is always a triangle. Okay. And with a one-dimensional price, you can only cut out a rectangle out of the triangle. It means you harvest usually only about one half of the market potential. Okay. And if you differentiate price it through tiered systems, through multidimensional systems, through pricing over time, dynamic pricing as we call it, you come closer to harvesting the triangle. So any kind of tiering, of price differentiation, of multidimensional pricing has the promise of a major profit increase. But you have to be cautious, because if you offer the lower prices to the people, to the market segment who are willing to pay a higher price, you may actually add up worse.
So even when you're doing this dynamic pricing, you still want to make sure that you're not under or overpricing, even though you may have a range of prices.
You have always to be cautious. Actually, with these more complex systems, you have to be more cautious because you are going to the margin. You try to exploit the willingness to pay in a differentiated way. You need more information, but the risk that you jump over the cliff is also there if you're not really well informed.
Right. Okay, I want to go back to something that you talked about earlier, where pricing is so much predicated on value, but you actually stated that it's perceived value. So I think that that's something that a lot of businesses misunderstand. So let's talk about the difference of value and perceived value in the marketplace.
Perceived value is the only value which counts in the marketplace, because it's what the customer thinks about the product. And I have spent hours, you could say years, with engineers discussing that their wonderful products may not be appealing to the customers. So I have heard so often, they said, if we make a good product, it will sell itself. A typical case was Opel, the subsidiary of General Motors. For many years, they were always in a loss situation because they had a bad image.
Right.
So the product was okay, but people didn't like the product, so they didn't buy it, or they bought it only at very low prices, which then did not generate profits. So not what the engineer thinks or what the technical features are,
Right.
is decisive. It's what the customer perceives. That's why we have to understand the customer. We have to look, so to say, into his head to be able to quantify the perceived value.
Okay, so
That's
if
our core job at Simon Kucher. Our job as such is not price, but understanding value perception, quantifying value perception.
so value is internal, value is what we think the product is,
Value is in the eye of the beholder, you could
right?
say.
And
Yeah.
so if price is predicated on value, and value is really predicated on perceived value is it feels like it's communication, it's marketing. It's marketing in the space. So is it a combination of not only just understanding the consumer, but then leveraging that understanding so that we can communicate more accurately to change the perception?
Marketing and communication are, of course, an essential part, determinant of perceived value. But it starts earlier. It actually starts with the product.
Okay.
And the first challenge is to create a product which has the potential to be highly perceived in value.
Right.
And then, in addition to that, we have the job for the marketing people, the advertising people to communicate that value. And you mentioned changing the customer's value system is very tricky, is difficult. I mean, everybody knows that it would be better to eat healthy food, etc. But we still eat sweets and hamburgers and everything. So knowing what we should do and what we actually do, driven emotionally, spontaneously, etc., are two different things. And changing the customer's valuation is very difficult. I would not recommend it. Influencing the customer's perception, that's the task of marketing.
Okay, so I get where you're coming from as far as we need to start early, and it's actually kind of in that R&D phase where if we're going to establish a price point, we need to make sure that the product matches up to that. Unfortunately, a lot of businesses don't have that luxury because they didn't listen to Hermann early on when they were actually building their business, and so they're out in the marketplace. What are the recommendations for established businesses to work or to change pricing, or really to change that perception? Is it a matter of actually changing the product or the offering, or are you able to re-engineer kind of the perceived value through marketing?
Of course, most products are in the market and are faced with competition and customer preferences. And if a product is successful, you don't have a problem. You continue, you make it better, you improve your product, your marketing, etc. If you have a problem, the first step is to find out what is the root of the problem. Is it the price? Is it too expensive? Behind that, are your costs too high so that you cannot afford to charge a lower price, which would be consistent with the perception of the consumers? Or is it the quality of the product? If the product as such is bad, is outdated, is obsolete, is not environmentally friendly, you need a new product. You have to innovate, to do R&D. You cannot repair this by changing your price. So the first step here is to find out what is the cause of the problem we have in the market. And then you have to act accordingly. Very often, the problem is distribution today. If you think of retailers, they are exposed to extreme competition from Amazon and the likes. And there, even if they cut prices, that would not help them. That would rather drive them more and more quickly into bankruptcy because they cannot afford that. So in the worst case, you have to throw in the towel and say, okay, with my competencies, my brick and mortar retail stores, I cannot compete. There's no way that I can become profitable. That's also, of course, with Corona, that will be a very frequent outcome we shall see in the next few months.
Okay, and you talked about your guys' firm really specializing in evaluating the consumer perception. What is the process to do that, right? When you go into a company and you guys want to, I guess, obviously understand what their product or their service is, but how do you go into the marketplace to measure what that perceived value is?
We have a whole set of tools, and let me describe shortly one of the more sophisticated one, which we call conjoint measurement.
Okay.
Conjoint because we measure the value, the perceived value, and the willingness to pay conjointly. And that's working in the following way. We confront the consumer with different alternatives of the product, maybe difference in brand, in price, in quality, in design. And then we ask him or her just to choose between two alternatives.
Okay.
And they make a couple of these paired choices. And from that, by means of a computer model, we can derive quantitative values for individual product attributes, for quality, for design, for package, and for the price. And that allows us to build a simulation model for the market where we can tell our client what is the outcome if you charge certain prices combined with certain product features.
Okay.
So that's very, very sophisticated.
Yeah, obviously leveraging the computer models, but
Yeah.
I
Of
see.
course, let me just shortly, for the sake of completeness, mention on the internet we can do price tests. We systematically test prices for new products, very new breakthrough products where the consumer is not able to judge the product. If you had asked somebody 20 years ago what is the value of a smartphone or a navigation system, consumers would have been clueless. There we are asking experts, we are doing focus groups, we explain and see reactions. So that is the most difficult one. If you have a breakthrough product, what will be the perceived value and the willingness to pay for such a product?
Okay. Well, I see a lot of books behind you. So I'm curious if there's a book or two that has been your favorite that you would recommend for businesses as it pertains to pricing.
Of course, that's my own book for practitioners. It calls Confessions of the Pricing Man. That's the title. So I confess what I did during the last 30 or 40 years. And for the real experts, I have a book, 600 pages.
Wow.
Also with some series that's called Price Management that appeared last year. So for a practitioner, I would recommend Confessions of the Pricing Man, and for a pricing expert, Price Management is the most comprehensive and most up-to-date, very, I could say, sophisticated pricing book.
Okay. I'm curious, you've had a long tenured career. If you could go back and talk to younger you, is there a piece of advice or maybe a couple of pieces that you would give yourself as you were starting your career?
Yes, I think the most important and most difficult point is to find out what you really want, what you really enjoy.
Right.
And this is not easy, it takes time. And in my first life, I was a professor for 16 years at the university. But then I gave up my tenured professorship and ran our company, which we founded a few years earlier, for the next 15 years as a CEO, and that was my true vocation. So you see, it took me many years to find my true vocation as an entrepreneur and a consultant. And as I said in the very beginning, my ambition was always not only to publish or to do theoretical academic research, but to influence practice. And I think this is the most important, that somebody really finds out what he or she enjoys, develops a competence in this field, and then goes for this ambition, vocation, or however you call that.
It's great advice. I think a lot of us, we kind of just happenstance through life, right? We just, a door opened, we went through it. But I think what is a byproduct of where we are at right now is that this disruption across the entire globe gives each and every one of us a chance to reevaluate the door that they walk through and say, hey, is there actually another door that I should be walking through instead?
Absolutely. As we see in competition, market shares, market positions are redistributed during crisis, not during good times.
Right.
And innovations, new ideas, creativity develop in crisis. When you have to ask yourself, where do I go from here? It doesn't go on smoothly, same year as last year. And so I expect actually from this crisis a lot of breakthrough of societal innovations. I mean, one simple point we are discussing now virtually. I often flew from Germany to Shanghai for a presentation of 30 minutes. Does that make sense under ecological aspects? I blew 2 tons of kerosene into the air. I spent 3 days going back and forth. And so we learn new methods, and we also see that some things are important and others are unimportant. And maybe we should shed some of the less important activities and time consumers and focus more on the really important things.
Yeah, that's great advice. I spoke to a speaker recently and he had the same sentiment. Why do I have to fly? For him, it was just across the country from the East Coast to the West Coast. He said, why do I have to lose 2 days to speak for 1 hour when I can do it right from my office where I'm sitting today?
Yeah.
Is there anything else that you think is important that businesses should be considering right now as they're going through this tumultuous time?
Of course, the buzzword is agility. Under these conditions, you have to make decisions and implement decisions much faster than under normal conditions because the environment is changing so fast.
Right.
On the other hand, you should not lose the long-term perspective.
Okay.
I'm just writing a new Hidden Champions book. Hidden Champions are unknown mid-sized world market leaders. And so I am looking at the development of the world, of globalization in the next couple of years. I don't know what will happen after Corona,
right,
but certain things do not change. And let me give you one extreme example. People say that the growth in the next 10 to 20 years is in Africa.
Okay.
That's right for population growth. The African population will double in the next 30 years from 1.2 to 2.4 billion.
Okay.
But when it comes to the gross domestic product of Africa, there's very little growth. Right now, Africa contributes 3% to the global gross domestic product. In 10 years from now, it will only increase marginally to 3.3%. So I think these big trends will not be affected much by Corona, unless we have the worst case that Corona destroys the economy. We will have several waves, no vaccine, etc. So yes, agile in what you do in the next couple of weeks and months, but not lose the sight of the horizon.
Sage advice. Well, Hermann, I want to thank you so much for coming on. Really appreciate you sharing these pricing strategies. And I look forward to having you back on again soon via video, but maybe we'll get you to fly over.
I'm getting what we call Wanderlust. So I traveled so much last year, for instance. I was 6 times in China, a couple of times in the United States, and I have to travel again. So it will not be pure virtual, but a different mixture of virtual and physical presence. Yeah, okay. Joshua, thank you very much. I enjoyed our discussion very much.
Thank you, Hermann.
Thank
Appreciate
you.
it.